So Africa once again finds itself on the receiving end of the Trump administration's actions, this time the new U.S. travel ban and restrictions.
Overnight, 7 African nations were erased from America's welcome list. No press briefing, no warning, just a sudden ban, total and unforgiving. Visas canceled, borders closed, futures destroyed in silence. Why did Trump target these specific countries? Was it about security or something far more calculated? Let's find out. It wasn't a televised speech. It wasn't even tweeted. On the morning of Monday, June 9, 2025, the news didn't explode. It dripped, quietly, coldly, from an update on the official U.S. Department of State website. No flashing headlines, no presidential press conference, just a bureaucratic statement with chilling precision. Effective immediately, nationals from 12 countries are restricted from entering the United States. No visa appointments, no embassy interviews, no special exemptions unless national interest was somehow proven. But the real shock? 7 of those countries were African: Chad, Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Libya, Somalia, Sudan. And they weren't just facing visa delays or paperwork audits, they were blocked, completely. Not a delay, a denial. A digital wall had been raised and entire populations were suddenly standing outside it, passports in hand, dreams in limbo. The reactions across the affected nations were not uniform, but they shared one emotion: confusion. There had been no diplomatic rumblings, no prior warnings. One Chadian newspaper referred to it as a bolt from a silent sky. In Equatorial Guinea, state-run TV paused regular programming to try and confirm whether it was a hoax. It wasn't. Even U.S. embassies in these countries seemed caught off guard. Social media pages for consulates in Tripoli and Khartoum quietly disabled comments. Embassy phone lines in Asmara and Brazzaville went dead within hours. For many travelers who had already booked flights, hotel stays, or medical treatments in the U.S., the only confirmation they received was from airline staff saying their bookings had been flagged. Not invalid, just flagged. A code word for, "You're not getting on that plane." The global media didn't react immediately. That delay, too, was telling. With much of the Western press distracted by other things, the story barely registered for 24 hours. But within African political circles, the impact was immediate and seismic. Diplomats scrambled for clarification. Business leaders called emergency meetings. University deans issued urgent memos to students with pending U.S. admission offers. And yet, in Washington, silence. There was no specific incident cited, no insurgency alert, no diplomatic breakdown, just a blacklisting of nations that, until that moment, had official bilateral ties with the U.S. What made the whole event more surreal was that this wasn't entirely unprecedented. People remembered 2017, when the Trump administration first issued its infamous travel ban targeting several Muslim-majority countries. But that ban had been challenged in the courts. This time, the 2025 version was tighter, broader, and faster. No debates, no draft stages, just a signature, and then silence. This time, there were no protests at JFK Airport. No legal groups camped outside the Supreme Court. No Hollywood celebrities writing open letters. Instead, there was an absence of outrage, of noise, of resistance. As if the world had grown used to these decisions. As if the people on the list no longer mattered enough to defend. That's what hit hardest for many across the affected countries. Not just the exclusion, but the indifference. It felt like being cut from a movie that was already playing. No one asked why. No one noticed. You just weren't in the cast anymore. But those paying attention began to ask different questions. Questions the official statement carefully avoided. Why these specific countries? Why now? Why so quiet? And perhaps most important of all, if it wasn't about an immediate security threat, then what was it really about? Because when you examine the list, who was banned and who wasn't, the pattern wasn't just bureaucratic, it was strategic. And that leads us to the heart of this story. Was this really about protecting America, or was it about punishing those who wouldn't submit to it? It was about control. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. To understand what happened, you need to leave the visa office and walk into the war room of global politics. Behind every so-called security directive is a geopolitical map, and every pin on that map has a story. When Trump signed that June 2025 executive order, he wasn't targeting danger. He was punishing defiance. Each of the African countries that ended up on the banned list had, in some form or another, been distancing itself from U.S. influence. Some had rejected U.S. military partnerships. Others had begun renegotiating or revoking resource contracts that were historically tilted in favor of American corporations. And some, like Chad and Equatorial Guinea, had recently entertained high-level delegations from China and Russia, exploring military cooperation, digital infrastructure, and direct investment deals that bypassed Western banks entirely. This wasn't just a visa issue. This was a message. Step out of line, and you lose access, not just to America's airports, but to its markets, institutions, and prestige. The travel ban became a tool of discipline, not protection. The punishment wasn't just to individuals, but to entire governments who dared to explore independence. Take Sudan, for example. Just months before the ban, Sudanese officials had finalized a trilateral trade agreement with China and Turkey, allowing the port of Suakin to be modernized without U.S. involvement. Suddenly, Sudanese students and engineers couldn't set foot on U.S. soil. Coincidence? Not likely. And then there's Libya, where the new transitional government had shut down a CIA-affiliated intelligence outpost under accusations of unauthorized surveillance. Days later, Libyan nationals were denied visas across every category. Again, no explanation, just execution, and the pattern continued. Even countries with little to no historical ties to insurgency activities like Equatorial Guinea found themselves locked out. Why? Because they had just signed a $2.5 billion oil refinery agreement with Beijing, cutting American energy firms out of the loop. This wasn't Trump isolating threats. This was Trump protecting his geopolitical turf. The visa ban was a quiet economic weapon, a calculated move to punish nations that were starting to slip out of Washington's grip. But the cover story needed to be believable. That's why his administration leaned on vague language like deficiencies in identity verification and national interest concerns. These phrases sound official but mean almost nothing in legal terms. They give the U.S. government unlimited discretion, the perfect smokescreen for targeted retaliation. And here's where it gets even more cunning. By labeling it a security measure, the administration shielded itself from international legal pushback. You can't sue a superpower for protecting its borders. You also can't easily disprove a negative. There's no way to confirm whether a country did or didn't improve its vetting procedures to Washington standards. In other words, the ban was unfalsifiable by design. That's the genius and the danger of how it was crafted. It wasn't created to keep Americans safe. It was created to make African nations think twice before acting independently again. But here's the miscalculation. It assumed silence. It assumed that these countries would swallow their pride, quietly appeal through back channels, and return to Washington's fold. What Trump didn't account for was that many of these nations had already begun preparing for a world where U.S. approval wasn't the passport to progress. And so, as the ban took hold, something unexpected happened. The phone lines that once buzzed with visa inquiries began to ring with a different tone, calls between African leaders seeking alternatives. For years, many of them had walked the tightrope between Western expectations and their own people's needs. But this ban, sudden, brutal, and unapologetic, cut that rope entirely. And instead of fear, it sparked something else: rage, unity, and a continent-wide response. Trump's administration likely expected quiet compliance. After all, in past decades, the U.S. had gotten used to African governments playing a passive role, accepting policy shifts, tolerating humiliation, and working around Western red lines. But June 2025 marked the moment that the script broke. The visa ban didn't just provoke criticism, it sparked a continent-wide wave of rejection, defiance, and, in some cases, direct retaliation. And what was most surprising? It wasn't coordinated from one power center. It erupted from multiple capitals at once, like a shared wound finally being acknowledged aloud. It began with statements, bold ones. The African Union, often criticized for being slow or overly diplomatic, didn't hesitate this time. In a press conference streamed across African news networks, AU Commission Chair Musa Faki Mahamat condemned the travel ban as an unprovoked act of exclusion, rooted in outdated hierarchies of power. His language was sharp, intentional. This is not about security, he said. This is about punishment disguised as policy. And for once, the condemnation didn't stop at words. Across the continent, various governments responded in their own ways, some diplomatically, some symbolically, and others with real policy punches. Burkina Faso delivered the most unexpected blow. Though not on the list of banned countries, Ouagadougou announced a complete suspension of U.S. visa processing. No new American visas would be issued, and those in process were placed under indefinite review. When asked for a justification, a foreign ministry spokesperson said simply, "If you treat our neighbors as untouchables, don't expect to stroll freely in our house." It wasn't about retaliation for self-interest. It was about solidarity, a rare but powerful show of African unity. In the past, African nations had often responded to Western pressure in fragmented ways. But now the ban was being viewed not as an attack on individual states, but on African sovereignty as a whole. Even countries with long-standing U.S. ties began re-evaluating their positions. In Senegal, university deans who traditionally funneled top students into American Ivy League programs started redirecting partnerships toward China and Brazil. In Kenya, tourism boards began developing new packages geared toward domestic and continental travel, citing external volatility. In Niger, lawmakers proposed introducing legislation that would prioritize investment from non-Western states, calling the U.S. ban an imperial tool dressed in modern language. Culturally, the shift was even more striking. On social media, the hashtag number Visa or Dignity began trending, with thousands of Africans sharing stories of how long they had chased Western approval. Visa interviews, bank statements, background checks, only to be discarded overnight. The posts weren't angry. They were resigned, reflective, and quietly revolutionary. For many Africans, the ban became a mirror. It exposed just how much energy had been spent trying to earn a seat at a table that was never truly welcoming. And once that illusion broke, the narrative changed. If access to the U.S. could be revoked with a keystroke, why build futures dependent on that access at all? This wasn't just diplomatic fallout. It was a philosophical shift. In unexpected places, from universities in Addis Ababa to radio stations in Bamako, conversations turned to continental reinvention. What if African nations created their own shared education programs instead of waiting for scholarships from Europe or the US? What if trade between African capitals replaced reliance on Western ports and currencies? What if this ban was a gift in disguise? A reminder that the future wasn't in pleading for inclusion, but in redefining the terms of engagement altogether. And beneath all this, a silent realization hardened into resolve. If a superpower can exclude you without cause, then maybe it's time to stop needing that superpower at all. As African officials regrouped and strategized, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to be forgotten, not because of the policy itself, but because of what it revealed. How little value African nations held in the eyes of those who claimed to be allies. The continent had been pushed, but it didn't break. It stood up. And what followed wasn't fear. It was a reckoning. Behind the press releases and diplomatic statements, beyond the hashtags and televised debates, something quieter and far more brutal was happening. Lives were collapsing in silence. Not in front of cameras, but in visa queues, email inboxes, and empty airport lounges. While African governments rose to confront the ban as a political insult, millions of individuals were left with no defense at all. No government could rewind the years spent preparing for a future that now no longer existed. Hotels near U.S. embassies in Khartoum, Tripoli, and Brazzaville saw mass cancellations. English test centers, immigration consultants, even courier services delivering application documents, all watched their revenue vanish overnight. An entire cottage industry built around legitimate legal migration was wiped out with a single U.S. directive. What made it worse was the confusion. Even among those with valid visas issued before the ban, uncertainty reigned. Travelers were stopped mid-transit, interrogated at connecting airports, or barred from boarding. Airline staff weren't briefed. Embassies refused to give written confirmations. Travelers were advised to wait and watch, as if lives could be paused like email drafts. Even those untouched by the ban directly felt its psychological weight. Students in Ghana, Rwanda, and Cameroon began rethinking their academic futures, asking themselves, is it worth applying to a country that can delete your plans with no explanation? It wasn't fear anymore. It was fatigue. The kind of fatigue that comes from playing by the rules for years, paying your fees, submitting your documents, proving your worth, and still being told that none of it matters because of where you were born. In quiet classrooms, at kitchen tables, in overbooked minivans heading home from closed embassies, a realization spread. This wasn't just a denial of entry. This was a denial of dignity, and no one knew when or if it would be reversed. Because that's what makes this ban different. It didn't come with an expiry date. It didn't frame itself as temporary. It simply declared, you are not part of the world we're building. The American dream, for millions, didn't die with fanfare. It was muted by policy, deleted by silence, and buried under paperwork. But what the architects of this policy may not have realized is this. When a door is slammed long enough, people stop knocking. They built their doors. By the time the visa ban had settled into the new normal, something else had begun to stir. Something far more permanent than protest. Across Africa, from dusty government offices to student WhatsApp groups, the conversation had already changed. No longer was it about how to get back in. Now the question was, what if we stopped asking for entry in the first place? The ban that erased African names from US airport systems became the spark for a deeper kind of awakening. For decades, the image of success in Africa had been subtly shaped by one goal: to leave, to get out, to study in New York, work in Houston, and live in LA. The West had sold the dream. African families had bought in. But now, the dream has been shattered, not by ideology or war, but by paperwork. And when a dream collapses, something else takes its place. This time, it was the urge to build new dreams. Here, not there. In Kigali, Rwanda's government quietly ramped up its regional scholarship program for East African students. Universities in Uganda and Kenya launched joint research initiatives, pulling in funding not from the IMF or USAID, but from BRICS-aligned education funds. And in places like Lomé and Bamako, startups that once pinned their futures on Silicon Valley began pivoting toward Shanghai, Ankara, and São Paulo. Trade ministries in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began drafting frameworks for a regional labor and mobility system. Their plan? To make it easier for African citizens to live, work, and invest across borders without a single Western visa involved. A decade ago, this would have been seen as idealistic. Now it felt urgent, obvious, practical. And while US media barely covered the shifts, on the ground, the change was palpable. Students began attending Mandarin classes instead of preparing for the TOEFL. Young entrepreneurs began pitching in yuan, not dollars. Central banks quietly signed currency swap deals with China and Russia to reduce dependence on the dollar altogether. This wasn't a boycott, it was a strategic exit. One by one, African nations began pulling levers that signaled something deeper than anger. They were rewriting the script. If the West would only open its doors to the obedient, then Africa would build a house of its own, with its own rules, partners, and terms. And here's the twist. The ban had inadvertently created something that years of Pan-African speeches and think tanks never could: unity through shared exclusion. The pain of being blacklisted was communal, but so was the realization that dependence had a cost. That cost had now been made visible. Families separated, futures discarded, dreams shut down like expired passports. What came next was not just policy reform, it was cultural redirection. Media outlets from Senegal to Namibia began celebrating local universities, local tech hubs, and local heroes. Billboards once plastered with "Study in the USA" were replaced with campaigns reading "Build Africa Here." In music, film, and fashion, artists began reclaiming the narrative, not as victims of the West's wall, but as architects of a new path. And this time, it wasn't about begging to be included. It was about choosing to walk away. The visa ban had tried to tell Africa, "You don't belong here." Africa's answer? "We don't need to." Not out of pride, out of calculation, out of clarity. Do you think this ban did more good than bad? Is Africa taking the right steps? Let us know in the comment section. Do you support Africa standing on its own feet? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.